Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Pat Cusick, and I'm the Account Director with the Muscular Dystrophy Association's Healthcare Partnerships team. Appreciate you joining us today for MDA's Industry Update webinar, the North Star Ambulatory Assessment and its role in measuring impact in the Becker GRAND CANYON study, presented by Edgewise Therapeutics. MDA's Industry Update webinars are programs which provide an opportunity for the community to receive information and updates impacting care and treatment directly from pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and medical equipment companies. These webinars are just part of MDA's education resources, and we encourage you to visit the community education pages at mda.org. You will find an abundance of resources, informative recorded webinars, and a listing for all our upcoming educational events. Now with that, I'd like to turn it over to today's speakers, Joanne Donovan, Chief Medical Officer, and Tina Duong, Senior Clinical Research Scientist at Edgewise Therapeutics. Joanne?
Hello, everybody. We're pleased to be here today to share some information on the North Star Ambulatory Assessment, the NSAA, and what it does, how it's measured, and its role in measuring impact in the Becker GRAND CANYON study that I'll talk a little bit about. Now, on the next slide, first, Edgewise is a public company, so there will be things that I say that are looking towards the future. Most importantly, sevasemten is an investigational agent that is not approved for use in any regulatory authority in any territory. On the next slide, these are the kind of things that we wanted to address today, questions we've heard from people. And because there haven't been many trials in the Becker community, wanted to drop back talk a bit about what happens in each phase of a clinical trial. And importantly, how does a clinical trial measure whether a drug works, whether it affects function in patients, because that's ultimately what we want to know. And to that end, Tina Duong is going to talk about the North Star Ambulatory Assessment, why it's used, how it's used, what it tells us. And then I'm going to finish off by telling you a bit about how Edgewise has used it in our clinical trials and how we are doing so in the future. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tina.
Great. Thanks so much, Joanne. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak about the North Star. I am a physical therapist by clinical training, so I will provide that perspective. The other one is that I'm a clinical trialist as well. I work here at Stanford, so I look forward to breaking this down for you so you can understand how the North Star may be used and interpreted or why it's used in clinical trials, as well as how it may be used for you in clinic. Next slide. Okay. So we'll start with clinical trials. Many of you who may be joining the Becker muscular dystrophy community, learning more about clinical trials, there's a lot of jargon that may be confusing. So we thought we'll define it first. Some interventional studies versus what are clinical trials and what do all these phases mean. First off, I'll start on the left side. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but on the left side where it says preclinical, what that means are these are lab experiments that may be performed in culture tissue or animal models to see if a treatment is hitting the target tissue. As well as understanding how its responses are in smaller animal models. One of the things I want you to remember in preclinical studies, even if it says Duchenne, make sure you read in the methods. There's different types of animal models, but if it's in the lab, don't take that as ground truth. That is a preclinical models, and trust me, there's lots of mice that have been cured before it actually goes into the clinic. Next, we'll just move on to talking about clinical phases of trials. Phase 1 is usually a pharmacokinetics or pharmacodynamic study looking at safety and possible side effects. And this could be done in a group of people who do not have the disease or the condition. And so this may be looking at the safety profile of that treatment. Next, we move into phase 2. And what phase 2, there's different models of phase 2, but really it's gathering evidence on the investigational treatment that will be studied. And usually this is recruited with patients who have that condition, for example, here in Becker muscular dystrophy. There's other things that they look at besides just motor strength. They look at other biomarkers that may give different routes of how they can get to a pivotal trial. Many of you may hear there's different pathways, such as like an accelerated approval pathway. There's just different routes to get to a phase 3. But the most important thing there is that between phase 1 and phase 2, they're going to look at what's the safety profile, what adverse events may be occurring, as well as the most appropriate dose that will get you to a phase 3, which is typically called a pivotal trial. And this is looking at comparing the benefits of the investigational treatment with either standards of care or other disease categories. And this is to show the effectiveness. Typically, we'll talk about endpoints as well. Typically, there's a chosen endpoint that will indicate the effectiveness of the treatment. Next, I'm going to go down instead of going to phase 4, kind of going down to open label. What happens after a phase 3 sometimes is what we call an open label extension trial. And once that happens after the randomized control trial is complete, the eligible participants in the study get to continue to receive that treatment. And so you may hear some of that terminology. And the purpose in that is to look at the long-term effects of the intervention as everyone then gets treated into the study. And that really informs us after a treatment is approved in what we call more phase 4 or post-marketing trials. As more treatments are becoming available, this becomes very, very critical. And what happens here is that once a treatment is available, we collect information on the risks, benefits, as well as continued real-world benefits of this treatment. Because if this is changing how you're moving, how you're breathing, eating, and your quality of life, we need to understand its impact. And so you're shifting almost a natural history that you had before treatment to an after treatment natural history that may result in changes. And why is it important for us to continue collecting this data after a treatment is approved? Because we know there may be other combination treatments that would be important. And we, as clinicians and scientists, would not be able to understand and give the appropriate advice without collecting some of this data to inform us on the clinical care. Next slide. Okay. So in clinical trials, how do we actually measure if the drug works for patients? And this is actually not an easy thing. A lot of the endpoints that we talk about, in particular here, the North Star, there's years and years of work that is done to ensure the endpoint itself is measuring what we think it's measuring and that it's reliable. We don't want an endpoint to miss the effectiveness of the drug. And so there's a lot of 10 plus years of development to get us there. But with these specific endpoints, we want to measure if it's safe and if it's effective. And here with the North Star, we're really looking at a motor endpoint. So assessing these endpoints, we usually assess it at the beginning of the study, in between, and then looking at towards the end to see if there's a positive or negative effect. Some of the terminology you may hear is that there's a primary endpoint. A primary endpoint is usually a measurement that is set at the beginning of the study that's going to measure the drug's effectiveness. There are other endpoints, such as secondary endpoints, which also measures additional effects. We know in Becker muscular dystrophy, muscle weakness is not the only problem, right? And so this may include things like cardiac, respiratory measures that's helps us better understand the totality of that data. Other endpoints that you may see as part of clinical trial are exploratory endpoints. These are nice because we get to then have, I kind of look at these as more like explanatory variables in explaining maybe why the primary endpoint is responding the way that it's responding, and hopefully in a positive fashion. Next slide. Okay, so now I'll go and talk about the North Star Ambulatory Assessment. So this assessment actually has had decades of work. It was developed by physical therapists to look at your functional daily life and the motor demands required of it, especially for those who are able to walk. In general, the scoring is based on if you're able to do the task without adaptations, or do you need adaptations. So that's a 2 is a full score. A 1 is an adapted score, and 0, you're not able to do it. There's a maximum of 34 points within this scoring mechanism. It's been well established. Like I said, we do use it in clinic. A lot of what you'll notice is that many of the primary endpoints or even secondary endpoints used in clinical trials have been used in natural history studies as well as in clinic, because then the clinicians and the scientists know how patients who are not treated are responding to that outcome itself. Okay. One of the important things when we're looking at endpoints or outcomes is consistency. So if the evaluator who's evaluating you can do it in a consistent fashion, we decrease the variability that's innate in usually these kinds of endpoints where myself as a physical therapist are looking how well you're doing something and giving you a grade 2, 1, or 0. The other thing is it has to be done in a specific order. We know that fatigue is a part of some of the variability in performance. And so we want to make sure within these 17 activities, it's always done the same way. So whether you come here to see me at Stanford or you go to the UK to see a physical therapist there, that is done in a consistent way. We thought the best way to share this information is to share a little video on the North Star and some of the activities that's associated with it, so you could see how it may be used in a clinical setting.
In Becker and Duchenne muscular dystrophy, the research community is working hard to find ways to limit the impact of disease. But how do we better understand how the disease is progressing and the impact of potential new treatments? One answer to that is the NSAA, or North Star Ambulatory Assessment, which measures the impact of Becker and Duchenne on everyday activities. The NSAA is a series of 17 physical actions, like standing up, climbing steps, or getting up from a chair. The assessment is done with a member of your healthcare team. For each action, you get 2 points if you're able to do it on your own. 1 if it's possible after adapting your technique, for example, holding a chair's arm to help you stand up, and 0 if you're unable to complete it. The maximum score is 34. A score of 34 means that Duchenne or Becker isn't really limiting your movement yet. But the lower your score, the more effect it's having. The NSAA is a well-established tool for Duchenne muscular dystrophy and is now being used to assess movement impact in Becker too. Here's why the NSAA is so useful for people with Becker. Studies have shown that in Becker, once you reach an NSAA score of 32, decline has started. This doesn't happen at the same age for everyone. The same studies show that decline may continue by 1 or 2 points every year. That means day by day, you might not notice significant change. But if you compare to, say, the same time 1 or 2 or 3 years ago, differences can become more apparent. Losing even 1 or 2 points can have a big impact. Little movements can make a big difference, like being able to climb a step or a curb, or standing up from a seat easily, or being able to get up from the floor after you've had a fall. The NSAA helps you and your healthcare provider understand how your disease is impacting your movement by routinely assessing which of the set activities you are able to do unassisted, which require adaptation because of muscle weakness, and which are no longer possible. That way you can be more responsive in your care decisions and have better control of your condition. If you're interested to understand your own NSAA score and be more involved in your disease management, consider discussing it with your healthcare team at your next opportunity.
Great. So now that you have a general idea of the North Star, I'm going to talk about the North Star in kind of a clinical context. if this is used in clinical trials, why is it important for this to be assessed if you're in clinic, and whether or not it's being assessed at all? One of the things is that when you're designing a clinical endpoint, the most important thing is to design something that is relevant to the patient population. We know that the North Star was originally designed and typically have been performed in Duchenne. However, a lot of work from physical therapists, including Meredith James in Becker muscular dystrophy, is helping us better understand what kind of loss is happening and what's the easier task onto the harder task for individuals with Becker, because we know that's different than Duchenne. And so here, what you see on the left side is of the 17 items, at the very top are items that are the easiest, followed by the hardest. And so you could see some of the more static items, static as in items that don't require a lot of muscle force or power. Standing, lifting your head, and walking, for example, may fall under the easier category if you have Becker. Then we get to more difficult items, and those typically fall under the umbrella of more transitional movements, such as being able to stand on one leg. And remember, walking is basically just standing on one leg at a time for a longer period of time. But the other one we know, speaking to individuals with Becker, is rising from the chair. Getting up from a chair is hard. What does that do? It impacts what restaurants you go to if the chair is too low. You're looking for high top tables or chairs that are too high, right? And then getting into the sitting position. So this may be difficult, getting out of bed. And then we move into more power, or as we say, muscles or activities that require more power, and that's running and jumping, or control of movement, such as getting up a box step, kind of like getting up a curb, or controlling your movement, getting down so that you don't fall down, right? And so lastly, the most difficult ones that individuals with Becker have a hard time doing is getting up from the floor. As you can imagine, many of you are adults and you don't get onto the floor unless you absolutely have to, right? And so getting up requires of all the proximal muscle groups that are typically more impacted for individuals with muscular dystrophy, as well as standing on the heels because of the weakness there in the TA. What we want to do is, even though this scale was made with the intention of understanding some of the functional deficits that may occur, we want to be able to relate it to something that's meaningful to you as a patient with Becker muscular dystrophy. So how you can help us in this is really understanding, as you're going through some of these assessments, if you lost the ability to do this, how would that impact you? Would it impact your ability to, go to the bathroom by yourself, brush your teeth, get out of bed? These are the kinds of things, as we are looking at the scale, we want to understand clinical meaningfulness. And the most important person that can inform us of that would be you, the patient. And so some of these things we listed on the right side that we've seen or been reported from patients who have Becker that is related to some of the items that we have on the North Star. Next slide. Okay. So what we know about Becker, it is progressive. As the video indicated, you lose 1 or 2 points per year. What does that mean? It could mean, depending on where you are within the scale or your independence or your function, it could be that you just do something in a modified way, or you're not able to do it at all. We know that there is a sequential loss of some of these activities, so it's important for us to track this over time. And as you can see here, some of the examples we have for example, a 2 versus a 1. A 2, you can do it without compensation. A 1, you do it with some kind of compensation. As part of the North Star, a 1 has a series of adaptations that the clinician's able to check if you're able to do or not to do with compensation. And as you're doing it's good for us to be able to track this over time. Clinically speaking, if you lose the ability, or we anticipate you losing the ability, well, your clinical team can anticipate what you may need to modify your home to ensure that you stay independent. For example, if you have a hard time getting up off the toilet, we may provide it's not called an elevator, but a seat lift, so that it's not the seat's higher for you to stand up, so you can maintain that independence doing that. The other thing is safety. If we start to see you have more difficult going down the box step, we may suggest some kind of assistive device so that you don't fall, because if you fall, you may not be able to get up on your own. So these are just some examples that the North Star may be applicable for you to talk to your clinicians and provide improved care. Next slide. Now we know that for individuals with Becker, there is what we call a heterogeneous functional abilities. What that means is there are people who can walk, jump, do squats, to individuals who are not able to do that. They may be in a wheelchair, even may have a hard time getting their hand to their mouth. We know that the North Star doesn't cover all of this. There is what we call the ceiling effect or the floor effect. And what that means is if you get a 34, which is the highest on the North Star, how would I know if we're just using this scale that you've gotten better? And that's a really valid question, right? We'll have to add other outcomes if you're in clinic to better assess this. But this really hits the mark on most people's abilities. What we found in a natural history study is that once you have some loss of function, which is about a 32 or so, there is an annual loss of about 1.2 points, 1.2 points per year. Okay. I'll talk a little bit about what these scores may mean so that you can have a conversation with your clinicians. You could see here 0 is an inability, has no points on the scale, while 34 is the highest. You'll notice that the color coordination here is associated with most likely to lose the ability to do the task. Yellow is it's likely to be adapted, while green, you're more likely to maintain that adaptation. Keep in mind, these are generalities, as we know from the natural history. You may fall in some part of the spectrum of the scale. An example is if you're at the top end of the scale, 30 or 34, you could do most activities except for the more difficult items I showed you in the last couple of slides, including getting up from the floor. You may need to use a chair or something to help. If you're in the 20s of this North Star Ambulatory Assessment, you now start to have difficulty with running. You may need assistance with getting up out of the chair, but you may not be able to do some of the more difficult things like rising or hopping on one leg. When we move down into the teens, as you can see, things start to be lost in some of these items, including the ability to step up or down from the box step. When you used to be able to get up from the chair, you're not able to anymore. And then the other tasks, such as walking and standing, may need adaptations. When we get more into the 0 to 9, the lower end of the scale, many of the items you may not be able to do, and much of it may need to be adapted. And so that's what we call the floor effect, because this scale was not designed to measure function for individuals who are not walking anymore. With that, I think I will now hand it over to Joanne so she can provide you a little bit more information on how the North Star is being used in the Grand Canyon trial.
Thank you, Tina. That was great information for folks. What I'm going to do on the next slide is just very briefly tell you about what we're trying to do to focus on muscle-targeted therapies. And in particular, what we're targeting is the injury that happens with muscle movement, with contraction of the muscle, that injures the muscle when dystrophin is lacking or not working right, as it is in Becker. We're developing a pill called sevasemten that is taken daily, and the goal is to protect muscle and preserve function. The next slide, we did a trial, and we have more information on our website, but basically this enrolled men in there from 18 to 55 with Becker over 24 months. And we looked at the drug and we saw what it did with the kinds of functional measures that you just heard about. And in particular, on the next slide, what we looked at was the North Star. And this shows the change in North Star on the vertical line versus time. And this was over 2 years. So you just heard about how things can change. And it may be you're losing a point here, a point there. And over 2 years, you would expect to see significant change there. What we saw in these men was that things didn't change. And they were able to hold on to these functions that are important in everyday life. And so that really encouraged us. It doesn't tell us that we can go take a drug to the FDA right now, But what it does tell us is that it gives us important information for moving on to the next stage in the clinical trial spectrum that you just heard about it. That was our initial trial. We have a phase 2 study, and which has moved into what we call a pivotal study, one that we can take to the FDA or regulators to say, yes, we think this drug is effective and safe and can be used in people. That's what our goal is. After that study, actually patients go into what was mentioned as an open label extension, so they can continue on drug and to continue with measurements like the North Star to understand what the longer term effect of the drug, of sevasemten, is on safety, on biomarkers of muscle damage that are circulating in the bloodstream, and on functional measures like the North Star. So on the next, we're enrolling men aged 18 to 50 with a diagnosis of Becker across the United States, Europe, New Zealand, Australia, and Israel. And they come in periodically, as shown on the next slide. It's at a month interval, 3 months, and then every 6 months for a total of a year and a half, where we look at how they are functioning in terms of things like the North Star and similar tests. We do blood tests, we do an MRI, there's no muscle biopsy. And the goal is to see a third of the patients would get placebo, that is not the drug. 2/3 of the patients get the drug. And then we look after 18 months to see if there's a difference, to be able to go and prove whether or not the drug is working, is effective at preserving and protecting muscle. Now, we are enrolling at a number of sites across the country. We tried to do this to make sure that people could get there as conveniently as possible. Of course, travel is provided and supported with as much as possible paid out in advance, so people don't have to pay out of pocket. And we are enrolling this year for the study, and we hope to be finished enrolling relatively soon in the next few months, so that we can finish this trial and understand whether or not this is a good treatment for people with Becker. So lastly, you've heard about the North Star and looking at it to reflect the overall, to understand the overall functional status of people living with Becker, also used in Duchenne. We know that in natural history studies where there isn't a drug involved, the North Star score goes down over time. And it can start to go down at any age, but once it starts to go down, it tends to continue. So we're using this as a clinical endpoint in the Grand Canyon study to look at the effects of sevasemten. And the goal for sevasemten is basically to preserve and protect the most susceptible muscle fibers and allow folks to preserve function and to keep doing what they're doing in everyday life as best they can. So we're looking at that in the Grand Canyon study. You can find out more on the next slide. There is a email to on the next slide to email to go to. And you can follow us and get more information. We are happy to answer questions. And I know that we are a little bit coming up to the half hour, and happy to answer questions. I see one question on there, and as this person knows, they've heard about this before. The drug is targeted to about half the muscle fibers, which is the fast twitch muscle. And what it does is it basically takes the edge off the contraction, so that you're not, if you can, instead of working at 100%, really exerting yourself and damaging the muscle, if you take the edge off of it, that can protect the muscle, but the key is to maintain function. And we've shown that in the studies to date, that function is maintained. It maintains them over the 2 years without making them worse. So that's the hope for that. And that's why we very carefully looked at the dose of the drug to make sure that we have the balance between those effects, between taking the edge off contraction, but not taking too much off contraction.
And what it would do to help you in that is that when you are performing your activities of daily living or you're working out, there is not that muscle damage that you hear about.
Mm-hmm.
And so clinically, that's why that's going to be important from a muscle function perspective.
Yeah.
I think there are quite a few questions for you on enrollment there, Joanne.
We are enrolling 120 patients, and we think that somewhere around the end of the year, we will be getting there. Yes. So in the not too distant future, that's our goal. We have thought about it for other diseases. We've looked at it in limb girdle, a specific kind of limb girdle, in which contraction also damages the muscle, and McArdle disease, another muscle disease, and seen protection in terms of the decrease in the biomarkers. So that it potentially could work for other diseases, other muscle diseases. I don't know about myotonic. We don't have any information on that, but we are looking and thinking about where it could be used more broadly than just in muscular dystrophies. That is. And yes, we are going to have results from the first part of the study, which is a year study, and that should be out by the end of the year. We'll have more information on that. We have a program in Duchenne as well, and boys that have been on gene therapy in the past. And as we expand, we hope to then start trials in non-ambulatory men with Becker, as well as non-ambulatory boys and men with Duchenne. So it's a stepwise process.
The ultimate of all questions.
And it takes a while. So if it takes us 18 months, then that means that it takes another several months to analyze the results, to then develop the package to go to FDA. So it takes years. That's why drug development takes a long time, because these steps, even enrolling the study, studying it over an 18-month period, it takes time.
And so the faster we can get the word out and get the sites enrolled, the faster we're able to look at the treatment's effectiveness.
Yes.
So spread the word.
Like Stanford. So we think that it would work with other drugs like givinostat, like gene therapy, exon skipping therapy. Right now, we are enrolling boys who've been on those drugs that have been around for a while. We haven't yet started to enroll boys or men who are on givinostat. So. Great. People ask if it's only for men. Well, there are carriers of the abnormalities in the dystrophin gene, and that is another group that potentially we could look at. When we develop a drug, it is helpful to know what the natural history is, what's going to change over time. Because unless you know what will change over time, then it's hard to design a study that can look at that change and put a reasonable number of people in. You don't want to have 2,000 people in a study to look at for a very small change. You want to be able to see a change over the period of time. And as you've seen, there's drugs that fail, and maybe they would have not failed if they were if a different group of patients were chosen, or perhaps a longer time. So the more you know about how the disease progresses, the better you can design a study.
that impacts the FDA approval. I mean, I think we mentioned earlier whether, you know, we take different pathways for it. I think this is where a lot of patients also ask us as clinicians, why is the inclusion the way that it is? One of the things is we have to make sure that there's a go or no go response to it. Is this treatment working in a group of people that we understand really, really well? Before we start to include all the other extraneous variables that make life real life, and then there may be too much noise to the actual signal of what we're assessing. So some of those are the questions that we get sometimes from as clinicians. Why does, you know, Edgewise only enroll adults for this, you know, or people who are able to walk? It's as Joanne was saying, the more we know about the patient population and the outcomes itself is what drives some of that. And we obviously are looking for the shortest route to regulatory approval, but these are some of the things that we consider.
Yeah. Somebody asked about what happens when the study ends. We have an open label extension called MESA, and in that part of this that study, everybody gets the drug, and we look at longer term effects, and that gives us important information on safety to bring to the FDA, but it also provides patients with the opportunity to stay on the drug during the process of FDA approval. It only targets skeletal muscle, although in the preclinical studies, the very earliest stages, we have seen some positive effects on skeletal muscle as well. And yes, we are thinking of more countries than just the United States. So we have Canadian patients that are coming to US sites as well.
And there's just different regulatory pathways. So FDA, EMA, as some of you may heard, is on the European side. So those are different regulatory pathways for approval.
Yeah. And I didn't say, we are enormously grateful because obviously we couldn't do the trials without patients and their families participating. And we know it is a sacrifice. It never, you know, there's a lot of challenges in life, and coming to a trial site periodically is another burden. And so we very much appreciate people participating. Okay.
Great.
Okay.
All right. Well, that looks like all of our questions. So thank you, Joanne and Tina, for a great presentation. A lot of great information there. Really appreciate it. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today for the Industry Update webinar presented by Edgewise Therapeutics. We hope you will join us in the future for Industry Update webinars, and I want you to all have a great day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you to MDA for giving us the opportunity to speak and share with you.